So my spiritual reading for this morning comes from John Shelby Spong's book, Unbelievable. The Easter experience in the New Testament, contrary to what we have traditionally been taught over the years, is not about bodies walking out of graves. It is far more profound than that. It is about God being seen in human life. By God, I do not mean a supernatural, invasive God who violates the laws of nature in order to enter time and space. I mean a transcendent dimension of life into which all can enter. An experience in which life is expanded, love is unlimited, and being is enhanced. I mean the God whose presence and power calls us all into our essential oneness, our universal consciousness, our interconnectedness. We are part of who and what God is. God is not a noun we are compelled to define. God is a verb that we are invited to live.
When the Sabbath was over, Mary of Magdala, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought perfumed oils so they could anoint Jesus. Very early, just after sunrise on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll back the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked, they found that the huge stone had been rolled back. On entering the tomb, they saw a young person sitting at the right, dressed in a white robe. They were very frightened, but the youth reassured them, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, the one who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Now go and tell the disciples and Peter, Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee, where you will see him just as he told you." They made their way out and fled from the tomb, bewildered and trembling, but they said nothing to anyone because they were so afraid.
Would you pray with me? Sacred presence. We have come from many different places this morning, with many different things going on in our lives, worries on our hearts and our minds, lists of things to do as we gather with family this afternoon. And yet we each desperately want to just take a moment to be in the presence of each other and in your spirit, that we might let those other things go and dwell in possibility and unlimited love and enhanced being. So help us to be in that space today. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be filled with your wisdom and your insight. Amen. So I try to always speak to you with honesty and with as much integrity as I possibly can. Which means that sometimes I tell you that I struggle with a certain topic or with a certain day. And as much as I hate to admit this is one of those days. And this is one of those topics that I struggle with, which is really odd for a pastor, right? You'd be like, Easter, hey, that's like a slam dunk. Mike, how was the Barcat game?
Not good.
Not good. Yeah, you should have been here Friday instead.
Pray for me.
So just like maybe that should have been a slam dunk. You know, my sermon this morning should have been a slam dunk. It should have been easy peasy. And yet, every year, I come to Easter and I think, okay, what am I going to say? What exactly is Easter about, aside from Floppy? Who is really cool, by the way, and totally can upstage me today. I'm good with that. What do we say today? Because, let me explain. Okay, most of you probably know the response to this. If I say the traditional Easter morning greeting, Christ is risen, you say,
He is risen indeed.
oh, some of you can do that better. You say,
He is risen indeed.
right, you say he is risen indeed. If we sang traditional Easter hymns that I did for many years in other churches, Our Glorious Hope is Ours Today, would have been Christ the Lord is risen today. Maybe we'd be singing Up from the grave he rose, with a mighty triumph o'er his foes. Maybe we'd be singing Because he lives. I serve a risen Savior who's in the world today. Maybe we'd be singing In the Garden, which is such a nice, pretty song. He walks with me and he talks with me. So, as always, you don't have to agree with me. But it'd be nice if you just listened to me and humor me for a moment anyways. It seems like Christianity has taken resurrection and turned it into resuscitation. That a body has been resuscitated. And in fact, for fundamentalists and for evangelicals, and probably for most conservatives, if you don't believe in the physical raising of Jesus, the resuscitation of his body, then you don't count as a real Christian. Trust me, I've had a few people mention that to me over the years. We don't think you're a real Christian, Kaye. You're not a Bible-believing Christian, Kaye. So that's where I struggle, because I don't believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. It defies logic, it defies reason. I have to end science. I fall back on the John Shelby Spalding piece where he said that Easter isn't about a person walking out of a grave. It's about something much more profound. It's about seeing the divine in humanity. It's about, and by divine, by God, we're not again talking about a being out there somewhere who magically enters a human body and walks around. We're not talking about an interventionist God who manipulates people and events to their liking, and who can be maneuvered if we're good enough, and who will hurt us if we're bad enough. I'm talking about a divine, as Spong says, that's another dimensional experience that we can all participate in. A dimension that's love-filled and grace-filled, that's unbounded, that's transformative, that's expansive. That's so much bigger than the God that traditional Christianity has created. The other reason I can't go there is that, that there are all kinds of other gods who've died and been resurrected. You know that, right? This is a tradition, this is a story that they told in ancient times. We had Tammuz, who was the spring god of Mesopotamia. We had Osiris in Egypt, who was the god of agriculture and death. We had a Hindu god. And we had a Buddhist god. And we can go on and on. There are a whole bunch of stories because they weren't meant to be like true factual stories. They were meant to be an experience. They were meant to explain why spring existed. They were meant all kinds of different things. So what if the author of Mark never intended for the resurrection of Jesus to be turned into the resuscitation of Jesus? Because really, where Ross ended the reading today, that was where the gospel ends. The women come to the tomb. It's open. There's a man sitting there. He says, Jesus has risen, has gone ahead of you into Galilee. They get scared, and they run. And that's where Mark ended the story. If you look at the end of Mark, you'll find that there's a couple other add-ons that scholars have all agreed were added at a later date because people were really uncomfortable with the fact that the women ran away and told no one. So we'll just add a couple stories in later on. The actual stories that we tell about Jesus being seen and eating with Jesus and Thomas and, let me see your hands and your feet, none of those appeared in our tradition until the 9th decade. 60 years after Jesus died. It was a much later developing tradition. So what if Mark just wanted us to understand that something amazing had happened, that a transformation had taken place? What if Mark's purpose was about calling us, each of us, into a resurrection experience, as opposed to getting hung up on resuscitation? And what does that mean then? What does that mean if we're being called into a resurrection experience? We've got that nice white-robed figure who's hanging there and says, again, Jesus is going before you into Galilee. Don't hang out here. Perhaps the intent is to say that you will find God now in your everyday lives. You will find God in the world. You will experience transformation where you live. There's another quote by Spong, who says, we will see Jesus. The promise of Mark's messenger seems to say, when our eyes are open to the meaning of God found in the midst of life, in the expression of love, and the courage to be, that we are resurrected when we learn that God is present. Resurrection doesn't just happen to Jesus. It can happen in and to each one of us. The gift of hope. I've been talking about all these gifts of Jesus, right? All through Lent. You're probably tired of the gifts of Jesus. But the gift of Jesus that he gives today is the gift of hope. In fact, our hope rope that Carol mentioned gives the gift of hope. And the hope is a transformative possibility for each of us. That we can be transformed by an experience of that other dimension. That we can be transformed when we love wastefully and when we give generously. And when we open our eyes compassionately and reach out to another. In all of those moments, we can be transformed, we can be resurrected, we can be brought back to life in new ways. One of my favorite Easter stories goes back to when I had a student pastor by the name of Brittany, and poor woman, she'll never live this down. But she had to do the children's time that morning, and I was sitting in the front row, and I'm watching. And she starts to explain to the children how Jesus is like a zombie. And I've got the zombie apocalypse going in my head, right? And she backpedaled really quick once she realized what she'd said. Because how do you explain this to kids, right? In a metaphorical way. Jesus was not a zombie, let's be clear. It was a metaphor to say that there is life after death. how many of you have had the experience, the privileged experience, of being able to sit by the bedside of somebody who's died? Yeah. And you sit there and you dwell in that space. And it's a beautiful space. There's so many people are afraid of it, but it is a holy space. It is a sacred space where we can bring love and peace and comfort through our stories, through our presence, through holding a hand, through singing a song, through being with family and supporting one another. And you wait as the breath gets shallower and slower until it finally is gone. And then for those of you who've had that experience, my guess is that if not immediately, within a few moments, you recognize that their life force is no longer present. That their life force is not in that body anymore. But that doesn't mean it's gone for good. How many of you have had an experience of someone's life force, even though they were gone? Whether it was just a presence that you felt, or whether it was words that you felt, or whether it was a moment of comfort and peace that you felt. Maybe it was something that's simply unexplainable and meant something only to you. I think that's what happened with the disciples. It wasn't that Jesus got up and started walking around. It was that they had that experience of his life force with them. That was so real and so present that it changed them, it transformed them from people who were hiding and scared and uncertain to people who were now courageous and determined and bold, to people who suddenly went, wow, maybe everything that he said really was true and vital to our lives. And we can't just sit on this, we have to do something about it. We have to share this. And so they go forth and they share and risk their lives because it was that powerful of an experience. Because they themselves experienced resurrection and new life and new hope and new energy and new possibilities. Because they themselves were no longer afraid to fully live and to fully love because they knew that it didn't end. I believe that that the message today, I guess for me today, is that we all can and do and have participated, experienced resurrection. I'm pretty sure that's just the Spirit getting really strong. Affirming that, yes, we experience resurrection. Or it could be the microphone feeding back. Give me an example. Share an example of how you or someone that you know, or maybe just an experience in general, has experienced new life, new possibilities after being, the disciples, they lost their dreams, they were shattered by grief, they lost their direction, they lost their hope, but they came back. We're the same way. It's an example. Because I know you've all had one. Wow, you're going to be shy on Easter, Ron?
When my father died, 2 days before he died, he clinically died. They brought him back, and he said, "Why did you bring me back?"
Yeah.
And a few days later, he died. And my brother-in-law was in the hospital at the same time with a terminal illness. And my sister went to my brother-in-law to tell her that my dad had died. She walked in the room, excuse me, she walked in the room, and he said, I just had the nicest visit with your dad.
Yeah, so a resurrection experience. How amazing.
That happened after my dad died with my cousin.
So another time when your cousin experienced your dad after his death. And I don't necessarily mean literal. It doesn't have to be an actual visitation. I mean, how do we experience resurrection? I mean, Sacred Journeys is here because I experienced resurrection, right? After having crashed and burned. That's a resurrection. Devin.
I was going to say finding sacred journeys.
So just finding this space for you was a resurrection experience. A change in your life in some way. Positive, obviously. And we're glad you're here. What else?
So we after a job loss.
Be after a job loss, finding a new job. Or a new purpose. Being able to play soccer again, right? After tearing your knee and having multiple surgeries. Rox.
Can I tell my poppy story?
Sure.
My mom died in early September. And I had told her that I needed a sign. I said, you know, Dad gave me a sign. And I said, so I need a sign. And she said, oh, don't make me do that. And I said, you'll be fine. You'll think of something because they'll be good. So I had this poppy plant, and they normally bloom like in June. And I noticed in late October that it was looking particularly healthy. And it bloomed one flower on Thanksgiving. That was what my mom started. I'm sure, but
Sure. So for you, the blooming of a poppy plant out of season, totally out of season. And then the question is, how does that change you? Right? How do these experiences change us, and how do we experience resurrection from them?
change my feelings about it.
So change your feelings about death. Change the fear of death. You know, we think about people who've dealt with addiction and come back from it. People who've lost a loved one and been able to move on. Divorce and being able to love again. There are all kinds of stories. And if even if you're not willing to say it out loud, it's my encouraging question for the day is to talk to someone about your resurrection story or stories, because I know we've all had them. So, the other thing I wanted to say is that resurrection has often been that one song that, it's a victory. It's like this once and for all victory that Jesus had. And I think that does us a disservice. I think that resurrection was simply another way to show that we can all have them. That he was human and we can have that same kind of experience. That resurrection continues on and on again. It wasn't once and for all. We all get resurrection experiences. But the key is not to stand there looking at the empty tomb. The empty tombs of our lives. Not to stand there looking at them. The answer is not to lock ourselves in an upper room and be afraid and huddled and never go out again. The way we find resurrection is to open our hearts and our lives and our beings to experience the presence of God that goes before us into the world, that dwells within us and works in our hearts. And that resurrection is for each and every one of us, always.